All right. So welcome everybody. My name is Stellan Windhagen. I'm director of the Resistance Studies Initiative. And we are having every fall these kind of talks. And if you look at our poster outside here and our website, you will see that the next up-and-coming talk will be on Barbara Deming and her radical feminist nonviolence. And then again in December we have the honor of getting Mandy coming here again, talking then about the answers to the questions she's going to pose.
Really?
Here today she's going to talk about why is it so difficult for us to work across identity groups and collaborate in resistance alliances when we live in a period when basically everyone that is not self-identifying as a male, white, conservative is being threatened. Still, it seems to be very difficult to collaborate across many different groups. So that's kind of the theme that the Resistance Studies is working on during the whole fall. We are gathering actually this weekend now in Connecticut with some 25 people from 7 different identity groups to explore during the whole weekend what are the best practices, experiences that people have of models of how to actually collaborate across intersections. So check out our website where you find a lot of information about resistance related stuff. Sign up on our sheet that is circulating over there if you want to get our mailings. We promise you don't get anything else that has with other stuff to do. Everything is about resistance. But we have a very broad idea of what is resistance though. We post stuff that is also done by many other groups here in the area or internationally and nationally. We also produce propaganda, this information about our initiative, where people can join in as being interns or in other ways working with us, where you find more information about our courses and stuff like that. And we produce the world-only academic journal on resistance studies. 2 times a year it's being produced. And we really need institutional subscribers at different universities to survive as an independent journal. We are making everything public access after 2 years. Please find ways of spreading it to others, submit to it, and get subscribers. Right, I think there's some snacks over there if people want. I think that's all. All right, so then I'm really so honored and happy to have Mandy Carter here again. She was here 3 years ago when we at the Resistance Studies Initiative organized a Black Liberation gathering over a weekend exploring the strategies and experiences from the Black Power period of the 60s and the current situation of the movement for Black Lives. But that was 3 years ago, and now we have succeeded to bring Mandy in to be a fellow in the Resistance Studies.
Happy.
So that's great.
I'm happy.
There's so much to say about Mandy, her work in different areas of anti-militarism, of LGBTQ. I can just mention that during the Stonewall anniversary, she got a prize, international prize for her work with that. And she's been very active in the War Sisters League, in the anti-militarist work there. She's coming from North Carolina, and she's part of a very honorable group of people, the National Elders Council.
You'll get a copy.
That brings together people that were key organizers and leaders in the civil rights struggle. So, with my utmost pleasure, welcome Mandy, and the floor is yours. And we will have a talk from Mandy, and then we will have
Q&A.
Q&A.
Yes.
When we have Q&A, please, people can say who they are.
Yeah.
We will tape only Mandy's talk, so when that's over, you don't have to worry about that. Your critical reflections about resistance will be taped. All right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you.
Good. Thank you so
Mandy.
much, Stellan. My introduction, my name is Mandy Carter. Home is Durham, North Carolina. I use the pronouns she, her, hers. So that takes care of that part of it. I really want to say thank you, Stellan, and also Debbie. I was here 3 years ago, and the fact that I can circle back around, and I think I'm now called a Resistance Initiative Fellow, which is cool. What I want to do today, and this is very informal. I just get but can I ask anyone here from any of the southern states, either born in or been in any of the southern states? Lee, who else? Can we just do a quick round? Where?
Maryland.
Yeah, but that's the where that line is, you know. All right. Who else? Where?
Undergrad in Tennessee.
Tennessee. Okay, great. And
Lived in Nashville for a little while.
Nashville, Tennessee. Anyone else?
High school in Florida.
Florida. Okay, that good? All right. I only ask that because when you think about the notion, and now that I live in the South, I've been living in Durham, North Carolina for quite a while. Some of the stories that I'm going to share, because here's the official title. I better read this again. The title of the talk is International Resistance Alliances, Our LGBT Movement at a Crossroads, semicolon, whatever that thing is. Are we about justice or are we about just us? And there are two interesting cases that I want to share with you in which we had that journey. And in an interesting kind of way, it talked about the complexities of this issue, how we struggled with it, and then, in my opinion, how we came on the backside of how we dealt with it. There's only two. I'm sure there's a whole lot more. And the fact that we'll be at the Valentine Peace Trust, which used to be called the Community for Nonviolent Action, can even dig further. I would like to say to you all right now, I am in the middle of questioning. I'm not saying I have any and all the answers. In fact, I would say to you, I'm in the middle of my journey as we continue this conversation. And as I look around this room, we'll talk about some of the demographics in a minute. But the question is, why did you come to this today? Why are you here at UMass Amherst? Why did I decide that this is something I want to do? So when you start looking at some of those questions and comments and complexities, I hope that not only with this particular talk, it's just sort of like, and where in the heck are we now in 2019? But I also want to sort of do a framing before I do that. One of the things that just background, I was born November 2nd, 1948. I'm a triple Scorpio. But I'm also part of that 74 million baby boomers born between 1946 and 1964. If anyone is in that space and you feel comfortable enough to raise your hand, if you were born between 46 and raise your hand. That's our generation, okay, 74 million. If you feel comfortable, anyone between the ages of 18 and 35, can you raise your hands? You're about to be ready to be 47 million. I can count. What do you think that means to have 45 and 47 together? If ever there was a moment, I'm really looking at this not like a woo-woo kind of thing, but that's amazing to think this happens to be where we are right now. So I will add to the intersectional resistance alliances, I'm going to add the words of intersectional resistance initiatives with intergenerational overlay. And let me ask this question. I am sitting before you at the age of 70. I came into this when I was 16. Why am I still here? And why are you sitting in this room? I hope you're not here because you have to be here, but I'm also thinking that if you think about who you are, what your options are, and the potential for intentional ways to do intergenerational conversation and activism and strategizing, if ever there was a time, I would suggest this is it, and I am thrilled to death about the idea that we can make that happen. So that's kind of the big picture where I'm coming from in terms of the conversation. That said, before I get into my two models, one of them is going to be around, let me ask this question. Does anyone remember in 1998, a black man by the name of James Byrd Jr. was murdered down in Jasper, Texas? Is anyone kind of vague? Just be honest, if you remember, okay, right. Within months, in October 6, 1998, a white gay student named Matthew Shepard was murdered in Laramie, Wyoming. Anyone remember that? Yeah. Okay. And what I find interesting is that if ever there was a time to talk about why that particular situation had an impact on our LGBT, I don't even know if we had the Q back in 1998, that would be one example. The other one is something really intriguing. Edie Windsor, does that name ring a bell to anyone? All right. Edie Windsor, and the whole issue around, and I will not call it gay marriage, but marriage equality. Remember, there was the whole issue around whether gays and lesbians and same-sex marriage, whatever, vaguely? Okay, remember. That's the other one, because that also has a kind of a backdrop into someone like me and other people like me. I am black, I'm a lesbian, I'm a woman, and identify as lesbian. And yet we have sometimes a movement that self-identifies its own kind of way, how the language is, what you believe in. But yet here we sit with that numbers we just got done with, the hands going up around the ages and whatnot. But overlay that with other things as well. Class, gender, geography, where you might live, how you speak. And looking at this is what I perceive to be a moment. I was just at this thing with Rebecca Tarlow. She just did her speech on occupying schools and occupying land in Brazil. And she had an interesting comment. She said, I wonder sometimes when a moment becomes a movement. Like you have moments, it's like, oh, there's been moments. But then how do they almost end up becoming movements? And I have a feeling for me, having been around to 16 and now I'm 70 and on that journey with a lot of us, I think we're in a moment. I really do. And it's a movement of moments, and I'll share that more. I do want to bring into the room one of the groups that we started in 1993 called Southerners on New Ground. SONG. Has anyone heard of SONG, Southerners on Right? Just a little backdrop. Southerners on New Ground, and the 6 co-founders, intentionally, we started out with three black Southern lesbians, myself, Pat Hussein from Atlanta, Georgia, and Joan Garner from Atlanta, Georgia. And we intentionally started out with 3 white Southern lesbians, Suzanne Farr, who probably wrote one of the best books on homophobia, A Weapon of Sexism, Suzanne Farr from Little Rock, Arkansas. Mab Segrist, who wrote a great book called Race Traitor, Durham, North Carolina, and Pam McMichael out of Louisville, Kentucky, who was working with Jobs with Peace. And when we intentionally had a conference, the first ever conference of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force called Creating Change, it was in Durham, North Carolina. It had been like in Washington, D.C. I think maybe there was maybe one in Maryland. But the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force decided it might be good to rotate those. And so in 1993, they said, could we host it down in Durham, North Carolina? And we said yes. And then we started getting the phone calls. Has anyone been to Durham, North Carolina? It's about a 5-hour drive from Washington, D.C., well, you lived in Winston-Salem and whatever. So here's the phone calls we got. And this is like an LGBTQ conference, just talking about the future, whatever. Well, is there an airport down there? Yeah, it's called Raleigh-Durham Airport. It's about 15 minutes from downtown Durham. Well, why are we holding it in the state of North Carolina? Isn't that where, if you recognize the name, very conservative, very anti-gay, very anti-people of color, U.S. Republican Senator Jesse Helms? We're holding it in Durham, North Carolina, precisely because it's the home of U.S. Republican Senator Jesse Helms. Question, well, will we be able to eat regular food, and what are grits? I am not kidding about that kind of and we're not that far, and we're not in Mississippi and Alabama. But so when we kind of got those calls and we said, well, maybe we need to think about if that's down to the, and these are people who are in the movement, we said maybe, and this is the pretext of the song, maybe we'll gather some of the people that are already organizing in the South, and we know. So it was Suzanne Farr, it was Pat Hussein, it was Mab Segrist, and said, let's just hold a workshop and have this conversation about what it means to be organizing in the South in 1990s and have the conversation about why is there such an anti-Southern bias in our own movement. But it wasn't just that particular conference. The National Organization of Women also had the same problem. We will never have a conference down in the South because we'll never be able to get anything done. Why should we go there? And then we began to see a trend. Well, if you all are going to purposely avoid coming into the South, then where are you going to go? Always go where it's comfortable? always go where it's accepted. You don't want to have the challenges about what it means to be organizing in the South. And by the way, North Carolina ain't the deep South, y'all. We're talking, I mean, that's not Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, where you had some really strong, amazing movements happen there. Hey, come on in, y'all. And there's some snacks, too, as well. So that workshop that we did in Durham, North Carolina, after we did the workshop, a few of us got together and said, hey, what if we decide to maybe form an organization? And we talked about that, and that one conversation led to what is now called Southerners on New Ground song. We're now in our 27th year. I would look back and tell you a couple of things that lessons learned, and if anything ever happened to you or potentially might be in terms of the work you've done in the past, some of the lessons that I think we learned on that, and one reason why I think we're here 27 years later, because the word intentional was important. The word intentional starting out from day one with at least parity in terms of black, white. That can all be different now. But also another important thing, the co-director model. Co-director could be 2, 3, 4, 5 people. You don't have to have one executive director. You don't have to have, this is the only way we operate. I would like to take just a few minutes to read a little backdrop on how we got that initial funding for song, because it relates to an organization called Resist. Resist, which is based where? In Massachusetts. And if I could just, if you could bear with me a little bit for this little conversation, I would appreciate that. So again, bringing into the mix, Mab Segrist, Pam McMichael, Suzanne Farr, Mandy Carter, Pat Hussein, we lost Joan P. Gardner to cancer 2 years ago, so I just want to honor her memory. Then after I talk a little bit about song, then we'll get into the beat of the conversation about the two cases, James Byrd Jr., Matthew Shepard, and then Edie Windsor and the incredible landmark decision of marriage equality. So are people familiar with Conscious Magazine? It's a faith-based group. Well, back in 2006, I wrote a little article, and that was 13 years ago. It might be good to write something and go back and think, well, what the heck was I thinking then when I wrote this thing? But if you bear with me, I just want to read a little bit of this, because I think in retrospect, Stellan, you can probably relate to this than anyone else. It might be good to think, that's what I thought then. This is where I am now. We're all on a journey. I can't say I'm the exact same person at 70 as when I was like 16, 26, 36, 46, 56, 66. That's all those decades. It's not unique to me, but you think about that. And please don't hold me to what I said when I was 16 or when I was 46. I changed my mind. Things happen. So you ready? So the title of this thing was called Roundtable, Overcoming Prejudice. Mandy Carter, and there was a bunch of other folk. So you ready? This is another organization we founded as well. What's that quote? Don't mourn, organize. If there's a need, fill it. So another organization I felt very great about helping to co-found was called the National Black Justice Coalition. So this is what this is. Am I doing this right? The National Black Justice Coalition became interested in marriage equality. This is hooking up with the Edie Windsor issue. Because organizations like the Christian Coalition, Focus on the Family, and the Promise Keepers, white groups with very few black folks as members, are actively courting and encouraging black churches and black spokesmen to come out with very anti-gay, homophobic comments, trying to make it sound as if the black church agrees with the radical white right. Remember, this was written in 2006. What was happening in 2005, 2006? There was a huge national effort, state by state, to pass these very anti-gay amendments and ballot initiatives. So that's the context of why this was written in 2006. While we have been dealing with the issue of gayness in the black church and in the black community for many, many years, the new wrinkle is that the predominantly white right is willing to spend a lot of money to get across the assumption that when one black preacher speaks, he speaks for all black preachers. This is just not the case. I have been monitoring this infiltration of the black churches since 1993. not so coincidentally when we started having that conference and the formation of Southerners on New Ground. When I saw up close and personal how it works, a group called the American Family Association introduced an anti-gay initiative in Cincinnati, Ohio. After the success of that anti-gay ballot initiative that happened in Oregon and Colorado, they preceded and they decided they wanted to do one in Cincinnati. The right tried to co-opt some black preachers to be the face and the voice of the anti-gay position. They spent in Cincinnati, I was there, $500,000 on that campaign. Money that came from Colorado for Family Values. And they had the face and voice of that issue was called, his name was Reverend Casey Smith, a Cincinnati black minister who successfully spread the message that black struggle for equality was not at all similar to the gay struggle. Unfortunately, we lost that battle in 1993, but in 2005, we overturned that amendment. That was a journey. I was there firsthand. I could not believe what I was seeing. But if you look at how that effort worked, and when you have $500,000 coming across state lines to put in place a face and voice of what that issue can be, and then yet you have a lot of our community coming in trying to figure out why. And by the way, they already had a pro-gay rights ordinance on the books already. This was to remove that ordinance. But I'll tell you who had a pivotal role in that to play, Coretta Scott King. Because Coretta Scott King, after Dr. King had died, murdered April 4th, 1968, down in Tennessee with the garbage workers, she really had to make a decision because now she was the face and voice of what King really meant. And because of her understanding and also having someone who was her personal secretary who was an out gay man, Coretta Scott King said, wait a minute, I just realized something. If you remember the issue of marriage equality, who were the first people told that you could not have full marriage equality? Women. Remember, women didn't have all those rights and abilities. So you had that based on gender. Who was the next set of folks told you can't get married in terms of issues? Black folk. Been there, done that. But until you had some way to literally figure out a way to explain that, to have a way to visualize that, and for Coretta Scott King to come in and say, by the way, I object, I think you're wrong, and it made a difference for her to speak up. But you know what else had to happen in Cincinnati? They have a huge black gay community. And with all due respect, and I think this is where we get into an issue about who is the face and voice of the issue. If the predominantly white gay group was trying to figure out, we don't want to have Reverend Casey Smith have this anti-gay initiative, but every time the cameras came on and the only folk who looked like they supported gay issues were white, it all but validated what he was saying. See, y'all gay white people want our rights. No. So it took that combination of both. So I say that because that to me is an example of what's happening right now. So it's not as if that's the only lesson that could be learned around what happened with the issue. And so the question is, can you ever compare being black to being gay? Can you ever compare the black civil rights movement to the gay movement, thinking that predominantly it's white folk? It depends on what you're talking about and who the who is and who gets to say the question. So I just want to leave that with you for a minute. That's about Edie Windsor and that connection we'll get to in a minute. And then the final one I want to read, I wrote in 2007, 12 years ago. And that was the 40th anniversary of, Resist. That's what I was getting to. And I was commenting, they said, Mandy, would you mind writing? That was 12 years ago. How old? I don't even know how old it was. Really. So I just want to read this short thing and then we'll get to the two examples. I heard about Resist in 1969. The year that I joined the San Francisco War Resisters League out in California. Resist wanted to find a way for those of us who were not draftable. This is the background of the Vietnam War when the draft was all but up and running. You know, that was like huge in terms of what was happening at the moment, the Vietnam War. At the point, Resist wanted to find a way for those of us who were not draftable, women and men over a certain age, to be able to make a personal testament of resistance to the Vietnam War. At that point, it was illegal to aid and abet anyone who did not comply with the draft. So the action of signing their call to resist illegitimate authority put signers at the risk of 5 years in prison or a $5,000 fine. Those who chose to sign the call to resist expressed individual accountability and understood its possible consequences. Others did things like question the war tax. Who's paying for the war? On your phone, you got the phone bill, there was a war tax that went to pay for the war in Vietnam. In these ways, the idea of nonviolent resistance and direct action impacts each of our lives, underscoring the role individuals play in demonstrating opposition. Resist was also instrumental as one of the first and main sources of funding for an organization called Southerners on New Ground. Thank you, Resist. Song wanted to figure out how to do organizing in the South in a way that would connect issues of race, class, culture, gender, and sexual identity. We understood that we had to find the common denominators between people and to find models of organizing that would allow us to do work based around those connections. Song believed that was an interesting way of doing work, particularly in the South. And if we could find models that work in the South, we could do it elsewhere. That was written 12 years ago. Song is in his 27th year. So how interesting, two different things, common connections, and yet you have to wonder why we continue to do what we do. So here's the two examples I want to give. On June 7, 1998, in Jasper, Texas, a black man who lived there, named James Byrd Jr., was getting a ride with 3 white guys in a truck. On that particular day, for whatever reason, they took James Byrd Jr., took him behind the truck, put a chain around his ankles, and dragged him several miles, and what was left of him dropped off in front of a black church. When that happened, that made news in 1998, and I remember a lot of us of color folk who were also LGBT wanted to know whether our national gay and lesbians organizations would speak out about this. Answer, no, it's not a gay issue. Hold that thought. Not a gay issue, okay. Brutal murder. Then, on October 6, 1998, a white gay man by the name of Shepard was beaten. Matthew, my apologies. Matthew Shepard was beaten on October 6th, hung on a fence, literally overnight, stayed there, but did not die until October the 12th. That's 2 days from now. That was 21 years ago. What was interesting about Matthew Shepard, and I'm trying to be very, very careful about how I say this. Front page of Time magazine. And as a lesbian of color, to watch why that ended up being such a major issue. And don't get me wrong, it was I was seeking on a campus, and we heard about Matthew Shepard sitting in a hospital, hoping he would not die. And within a couple of days, he was gone. And then a lot of us asked the same organizations, when we came to you and asked you why you did not respond to what happened to James Byrd Jr., a lot of them said, we need to think about this now. But what was the defining issue? It was the mothers. Judy Shepard basically said at one point, why my son ends up on Time magazine, and everyone says, well, what do you expect to happen in Jasper, Texas? But it was the mothers who got together and had this conversation about the commonality of what just happened. They had to bury 2 sons. Brutal murders, because someone said, it's okay, we can just go kill these people, nothing's going to happen to us. And why do they come together and have that conversation? Because sometimes what you call accidental activists, it's like, you saw the parents of James devastated. Why did this happen to my son? And yet, when the conversation kind of happened, because then all of a sudden they were looking around, Texas has a lot of good folk there as well, as do folks in Laramie, Wyoming as well. So to make a very long story short, the fact that the mothers got together, had the conversation, and then they had that conversation, and there's been a couple of movies and a couple of books around it. Because for them to get together, and they understood that what the common denominator was, it was a hate crime. That was the bottom line. It was a hate crime. It was a hate crime, and because you had the sense of, if you don't like it. But can we even back that up a little bit? Let's go back to Money, Mississippi. Right? Let's go back to when it was okay to just lynch folk out there. Let's go back to slavery when you weren't even considered a human being. So you start backtracking, and all of a sudden, what is it about this society, this country in which we live? And what is it about the uniqueness of why one set is a us and okay, and another set is not? Well, what I loved about this intersectional racism in terms of resistance was that because the mothers got together, had the conversation, but that created a conversation across the whole country. The papers and the magazines and the media was full of this, like, what was that all about? And because of that, and because the first ever African-American president, son of an interracial marriage, what used to be against the law, Obama, now they have the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Act. And anyone can go back and read about that. That was a defining moment. That was a teachable moment. That was a game changer, right? But it mattered that you had LGBT folk of color willing to be raise the question. And then you had parents of their son who was gay, and you have groups like Parents in, PFLAG, and you have other organizations which parents and family and friend, mommy for the first time understood what it was like, and even though I'm not, I can feel that pain. I know what that feels like. I know what that looks like. And then even with PFLAG, real briefly, you had a lot of parents who joined PFLAG, and all of a sudden their friends were abandoning them because you said you had a gay son, you had a lesbian daughter, you have a trans child. And for someone who's straight and an ally to have that done to them, it might get to the closest of what you can do about what does that feel like? What's the empathy? So that to me is a success story, but it's based on a lot of pain, a lot of hurt. But please remember what that was. And again, October 12th, in 2 days, will be the 21st anniversary of those murders. And what do we do with that? Now, there's a thing called the Laramie Project. I think they do. Have you done that here on this campus? The Laramie, it's like a play. And they kind of like do the play of this and whatever. But it would be neat if you were to think about whoever's here and moving forward, could there be some kind of a cultural thing or some kind of other way, poetry, spoken word, in which you talk about this James Byrd Jr., Matthew Shepard experience, right? That would be it. Where's my clock in time to time? Then the other one I want to talk about, I just want to say, and by the way, when they did the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Inn in New York City, they have now a big wall of remembrance. Judy Shepard and Dennis Shepard were there. The parents of Matthew Shepard were there. I was there, and some other folk were there in order to mark the moment. So that's James Byrd Jr. and Matthew Shepard. Remember that little thing I talked about, Cincinnati and the whole marriage issue back in 2006 or whatever? This one's going to be about another landmark United States Supreme Court decision. In 2015, the United States Supreme Court had a number of cases before it, and one of them was the issue of lesbian I'm getting all these names mixed up, Edie Windsor. Edie Windsor was married to her partner, was with her partner, and yet because they were not legally married or recognized, when her partner passed, Edie could not. What's the word you do when you're married? You can have like a tax write-off. Yeah, it wasn't just a state. Yeah, it was more of that. It was more like, why cannot a same-gender couple have the same rights as a heterosexual couple when it comes to any of those things, and death and whatever it might be? She took it to the U.S. Supreme Court and she won. She won. But she won because part of it was based, when you have to backtrack it to when people were looking at this issue of marriage equality, not gay marriage. Please do not use the word gay marriage. Marriage equality based on women, based on gender, and then based on the issue of race when it came to that defining U.S. Supreme Court decision, Loving versus the state of Virginia, June 1967. I graduated high school in 1966. I didn't know interracial couples couldn't get married. I had not a clue. But it was Richard Loving, a white man, married to Mildred Jeter, a black woman. I am not a lawyer, but if someone told me that the United States Supreme Court decision on probably one of the most consequential things was called Loving versus the state of Virginia, they won by one. Look at the Supreme Court we have right now, by one. Now here's the question. A lot of people didn't like the idea of interracial marriage. I mean, people got murdered just on the fact, do I need to go there? So they get the case, they win. You think people woke up the next day and went, well, of course, what were we thinking? No. People still hated the idea, but it didn't matter. It was on the books. And now I'm looking around this room, I'm looking around this country, I'm looking around, and how many people are biracial, triracial, whatever it might be. But what if they had done the same thing when people said, don't bother, you're never going to make it, it's never going to happen? That's what they said to Edie Windsor. That's what they said to other folk. They said, no, I'll take it to the court. And they won. And I would suggest where we are now, when I think about how change happens, how does change happen in society? I would suggest the changing of hearts and minds and the changing of public policy. Hearts and minds can be, why do we do pride marches? Why do we have that Million Women's March with the pink pussy hats? Why do we have concerts? Why do we have sit-ins? Why do we have marches? There's something about that cultural part of hearts and minds. How do you change people's opinions and values, hearts and minds? You can't put a price tag on it, but it's part of it. But then there's also the importance of the changing of public policy. It does matter if you have a lawyer who could take something to your city council or your city court. It doesn't matter if you can take that to your state court. It doesn't matter if you go to the United States Supreme Court. And sometimes they're in balance and sometimes they aren't. For instance, that incredible decision of Loving versus State of Virginia. People didn't like that. In fact, it was just a case in Mississippi where someplace, I ain't going to marry you because you're not the same, race. It didn't matter. But the fact that our first African-American president, son of an interracial marriage, has been there for 8 years, and he was willing to accept the LGBT component of that, it's extraordinary. That was a game-changing moment. And then there's other times when public policy ends up, when cultural stuff ends up being kind of like, for instance, I was just sitting here thinking, I was talking to someone who was 15 just recently in Durham, and she said, because there were so many people going, did anyone go to the Women's March up in D.C. that we had not recently? Yeah, you saw how many down in, oh yeah, and you had it here. Yeah, oh yeah, I'm thinking I'm in Durham, down in D.C. But she went to one in Raleigh, North Carolina. 30,000 people, 10,000 in Nashville, North Carolina. So when you have that might, we still don't have we don't have the Equal Rights Amendment, but the fact that you have that level of engagement and wanting to be a part of something can really make a difference. So Edie Windsor wins the case, U.S. Supreme Court, 2015. That same U.S. Supreme Court all but gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Here we go again. As a black lesbian on that day, I was torn. I was very happy that we got that win around same-sex marriage, but I was devastated that they took away the Voting Rights Act of black folk, because we saw what that journey was. So what do you do with that? And how many times do we have to be put in that situation? And we divide ourselves, and how do we decide where we're going to go, and how do we be allies in terms of the issue and the struggle? And so where we are now, in terms of how we deal with this issue, and maybe when we get to the Q&A, what do you do with that? And there's going to be more of those coming up. I can name you a number of other ones. And hopefully we'll have some other examples of what people have as well. But why do we keep putting ourselves in a situation of every time we have to choose between my race, my culture, my class, my gender, and yet you have something over here in which, but then I can maybe get this because of who I am. And why don't we just say, no, unless we can get it all together, I'm not going to move forward. And I'll finish with this one that gives you the most basic example right now. There was a thing put forward called the Employment Non-Discrimination Act several years ago. It meant that anyone who was gay or lesbian, I'm not sure about bi trans, I'll have to check on that, that you could never ever lose your job based on your sexual orientation or gender identity. And some organizations came out and said, yes, and exactly, and that's what I'm getting to. And so what I'm saying is that, and so when that was put forward, it was almost like what happened up in Seneca Falls when the women had to decide when they were going to go ahead and try to promote the idea of a women's right to vote. Do we or do we not include black women? And the issue was, no, we'll come back and get you later. I was not there, and I can understand whatever the rationale was. But remember, that's what they did. No, but we will come back and get you later. But they had to move on that forward. Now we get to the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. The exact same thing happened. If we want this to move forward, you had Barney Frank, the Human Rights Campaign Fund, with all due respect, say, yeah, but we'll do the gay and lesbian, but no, we can't include the trans. Oh, really? Well, we'll come back and get you later. But this time people said no. If you do not include everyone right from the very beginning, did we not learn our lessons from Seneca Falls? No, we're not going to do it. And fortunately, people got and they understood you cannot move this forward unless everyone's involved at the same time. So here we sit in 2019, and we keep on having these issues come up. And if and when that comes up again, it will. How does one act? What do you do? And what's going to be the things that you could use as sort of like instruments of change and what that might be, the possibility of that. So again, got a major win in marriage equality, and then almost the total destruction of the voting rights at 65. I'm going to end by telling you some wonderful things and work that gives me hope, and why in an interesting way with these two examples. Because we got wins both ways. I'll tell you what gives me hope right now. It is now October the 10th. I just came from North Carolina, where we have 2019 municipal elections happening in North Carolina, other parts around the country. And one of the things that we've been struck by is the demographics going into 2020. And I'm looking at y'all who are 18 to 35. Could you raise your hands again if you don't mind? Okay. And all of us who are in the other bracket, and anyone who falls in between, sorry, I don't know if you're GX, Gen Z. Are you Gen Z, G, K? What?
The X is what gets forgotten.
Oh, X, are you Gen X? And what is that? What age?
It's the middle one that always gets forgotten when people like do it on the
Yeah.
show. Still like completely forget it.
Yeah. Well, we're going to include you. Anyone else in that? Yeah, we'll include you.
Yeah.
So here's what gives me. Are you all part of that too? All right. No shade. So here's what gives me hope. Now, I have been an eternal optimist all my life. Always have been. Always, like, bring it. You know, if you have a challenge, that triple Scorpio thing, that's what I think that's all about. Any other Scorpios in the room? Let's anyone else? Am I the only one?
That's why you're in front.
All right. So here we go. Anyone who will be 18 by November 3rd, 2020, Election Day, will be a person of color. I repeat what I just said. That's the demographics of this country. Anyone who will turn 18 by November 3rd, 2020, will be a person of color. Caveat, you better damn well get registered and vote. That's one demographic. You just saw the one I said about the baby boomers and, I don't know, whatever, that number. Now here's if, we get into some same conversation and communication about how we're going to do this systematically, precinct by precinct, city by city, county by county, state by state, congressional, that's going to have to happen. It's not going to just be because you wish it. There are literally plans in place about how you do that state by state. How many people are out of state from here going to this campus? How many out-of-staters? Now, are you all registered, or you? I don't know if you can register on this campus, or do you try to vote where you are? And okay, because I'm thinking in terms of the next upcoming classes, that will be the next one coming in. How do you maneuver that? Because yeah. Go. Where are you from?
I'm from New York.
And how does that work for you?
So you have to get an absentee ballot form. You can get that online and fill out dates of when you want your absentee ballot to be sent to you.
And that would be for New York, to vote in New York?
Yes.
No, that's good.
Mine's on the way.
Yours is on the way. And is that true with the other folks? And that's just the UMass policy? UMass Amherst policy?
No, I mean, I could register to
Oh,
vote here.
yeah.
Use my UMass address.
Uh-huh.
I'd have to change it every time the address changes, like when my dorm changes.
Okay.
From year to year. But I want to vote in my New York local elections.
Yes.
Keep my New York ballot.
Very good. And similar, and even things like that, it's good to know that, so people would know if, when, where, and that might happen. The other one that I like that I think is going to really be interesting, this is 2020, the census is coming up. Those going to draw the lines for the next 10 years. And April 1st is going to be the date. And what's interesting, a lot of that's online now, and they're going to figure out where the college campuses are, where you are, and it's where you physically are at that April 1st date. But don't wait until April 1st, 2020. There's already information about, I think there's also a queer census going on through the task force, the taskforce.org, so the census is coming up. And given the shift in demographics, it would be to our advantage about how you politicize that, how you culturalize that. That would be another one. The state of North Carolina now is 51% women. Every 100 counties has majority women that are majority in terms of women and what you do with that vote or whatever. And then also, this is the one that gives me the most excitement, but it's very challenging. In 2020, and how political can I be or not? At this point, what the heck? And you can cut that out of that tape. I don't want it showing up at, no, I'm just kidding. Here's what's interesting. Right now, we have the U.S. House is like predominantly Democrat. The U.S. Senate is predominantly Republican. But in 2020, there'll be 23 U.S. Republican senators up for re-election. 11 of them are in the South. I won't even mention the man's name, but should he get re-elected, if we can take the House and take the Senate, he's done. If he's not, if we can take the House and Senate, then we only need to flip four U.S. Senate seats. If he doesn't, we need to flip 3. As a Southerner, out of those 11, here are the states that are in the mix. North Carolina, Tom Tillis. South Carolina, Lindsey Graham. You've got 2, Georgia. You've got Alabama. You've got Mississippi. Bring it. I am not kidding. If we can, I would love to flip all 4 of those in the South as far as I'm concerned about what that might mean. But I'm not being disrespectful. I'm just telling you how politics work. And if you think of the other, but also all politics is local. I am just as much interested in my Durham City Council members and my county commissioners and my school board and who sits on water and soil and water. So all politics being local in terms of the demographics, in terms of this upcoming election, it's a defining year. And again, the numbers really will give us an opportunity. And then the other one, I would finally end up language justice, food justice. We kept on adding to that list that Song has done. I wanted to be a doctor. And when I was in Mount Pleasant High School, I had to take a foreign language. Jane, you're hearing the same thing I did for your book. I had to either take French, German, or Spanish. The first 2 were not going to happen. I took Spanish and I flunked. I remember thinking, well, who's ever going to need that? Who knew? Who knew? And so there's an intentionality, not only learning how to speak it, but the interpretation and the equipment and how we talk about things going out in Spanish and English and any other language, like how do we want to be inclusive? So intersectional, intergenerational, how we talk, how we move, and then also those little signs out there that are the blue signs about you can't park here. That was a movement. That didn't just come out of the blue. That was a movement that had to happen, the disability rights movement. So when I look around me and I'm sitting in this room and I'm having the conversation with y'all, we're in a moment, a movement of a moment. So bring it, count me in. I'm done.